Good afternoon. My name is Greg Smoke, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the American West Center's conference, our 50th anniversary symposium, Western Lands, Western Voices. I thank you all for coming to celebrate the Center's 50th anniversary and to explore the important work of public engagement in the humanities and the social sciences. It's a dedication to community-engaged scholarship that is at the heart of the Center's mission and is what brings us all together here. Now, at the very outset, I need to acknowledge our very generous sponsors that made the symposium possible. The Office of the Senior Vice President of Academic Affairs at the University of Utah, the J. Willard Marriott Library of the University of Utah, the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University, the Church History Library and Museum of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the University of Utah College of Humanities, Zions Bank, the Bill Lane Center for the West at Stanford University, the Environmental Sustainability Studies program here at the U, the Smith Pettit Foundation. We got a long list of people we're very thankful for. The Honors College at the University of Utah, the Utah State Division of History, the Natural History Museum of Utah, which will be our location this afternoon for our reception, the Center for Public Policy and Administration at the U, as well as the Environmental Humanities Graduate Program, and the Taft Nicholson Center for Environmental Humanities Education, Montana, the Magazine of Western History. And did I skip over the Western Historical Quarterly? I think I did. I went right past that. That was just for David. The University of Utah Press, the Utah Museum of Fine Arts, and a special thank you to Floyd and Sean O'Neill. All right, so those are our sponsors. Get that done. I also wanted to say that throughout the history of the American West Center, we've had the privilege of working with and for dozens of native nations across the West. And so I also want to start out by acknowledging that Utah is also native land and to recognize the original peoples of Utah, the 8 tribes that today live in the state of Utah. And going from the northwest to the southeast, roughly, the northwestern band of the Shoshone Nation, the Confederated Tribes of the Goshute Reservation, the Skull Valley Band of Goshutes, the Ute Indian Tribe, the Paiute Indian Tribe of Utah, the White Mesa Utes, the San Juan Southern Paiute Tribe, and the Navajo Nation. So we wanted to acknowledge that. I also want to thank my staff, the people that did a lot of work over the last year and a half or so to make this happen. We really started talking about this 2 years ago. Michelle Turner, who is taking pictures right now, who is the administrative assistant at the American West Center. Leighton Quarles, who I do believe is eating his lunch out in the hallway, still registering people, who is the assistant director of the American West Center. I hope he hears that. And Cassie Clark, who, are you in the room, Cassie? Who is the program coordinator. And they did a lot of the heavy lifting to get this done. Also, the other folks who work at the center this year have been pitching in as well. So I want to acknowledge Mike Shamo. I think Mike's here. Susie Catherine is right there. And Vicki Newman is right down front here. I put her on the spot. She doesn't like to be. All right, one more piece of housekeeping before I get the introduction going. And that is that this afternoon, if you check your program, you'll see that there is a walking tour that will end at the reception. And I'd really encourage you to go. Bob Voiles, who's sitting over here, who is the director of the Fort Douglas Military Museum, has kindly agreed to do this tour. He'll meet us at the Fort Douglas Post Cemetery, the old historic cemetery, which is just up the hill here, and talk about the cemetery and some of the preservation projects that the Fort Douglas Museum has been doing. And then we'll wander on up the hill to an amazing location. I got my fingers crossed that the weather's going to hold because it is spectacular. We have the 5th floor of the Natural History Museum of Utah, which is probably the best view in the entire Salt Lake Valley. And I'm not kidding. This is an amazing facility that's a couple of years old now, but just a great spot. But if we got thunder and lightning, they probably won't let us out on that deck. So I'll keep my fingers crossed. All right. Now, earlier I said it was my pleasure to welcome you to this event. It is also my privilege. 27 years ago, this month, I came to the University of Utah to enter the PhD program to work with our keynote speaker, Richard White. One of the first pieces of advice that Richard ever gave me was to make the trek up to the old Annex building and to meet Floyd O'Neill to find out about the American West Center. And I did that. And I didn't know at the time, of course, that it really would shape my entire future. I had no way of knowing that. I began working for Floyd at the center in the summer of 1988, and though I've lived in other places and taught in other places, I really never left. It's kind of hard to leave once you are associated with the center. So I started working for Floyd in 1988, and when I came back to the University of Utah in 2002, the opportunity arose a couple of years later to become the director of the center. So this has really been a homecoming for me. I'm very proud to have been part of this place for more than half of its existence. And so what I'm going to do today is introduce Floyd O'Neill, who will make a few comments and then introduce our keynote speaker. Floyd O'Neill is Director Emeritus of the American West Center. He's also a Professor Emeritus of History. For many in this room, Floyd needs no introduction. His personality and his humor are as big as the West, and his, shall we say, colorful aphorisms are legendary. We will probably hear a few of those this weekend. Floyd began his career at the American West Center in 1967. So yes, if you do the math, he's been part of the place for 47 of its 50 years. Over the past half century, Floyd has also become a beloved figure in Indian country. He has worked with dozens of tribes from the Lummi of Washington State to the Tohono O'odham on the Arizona border, and all points in between. He has been a recipient of the WHA, the Western History Association's Award of Merit, and in 2001, he was one of the first honorees of the Indian Scholars Group of the Western History Association for his mentorship, an award that Richard White also received a few years later. I would wager, however, that the recognition he treasures most has come from the special awards of appreciation given to him by Native nations, such as the Ute tribe of Utah and the Zuni Pueblo. And for the achievements that he treasures, I think the most are the students that he's had, that the people he's mentored, and their achievements. And he's told me as much. It means a lot to him. He means a lot to me. I mean, he really, as somebody who's been a very, very important figure in my life. And although he retired, and I should say retired from the University of Utah officially in 1996, he still comes to the office on a daily basis. And sometimes he will even call when he's not going to be there that day and say, Greg, I'm not coming in today. And I remind him, Floyd, you retired in 1996. You don't have to call, right? And so what I want to do is, without further ado, I will bring Floyd up here. I hope he's not too shocked with the seriousness of my introduction. There'll be plenty of time to get back at him this weekend, and I'm sure that tomorrow evening we'll hear some very humorous stories. But I just wanted to give my heartfelt thanks to my, at 87 years of age, oldest friend, literally, and somebody that I truly love and has meant a lot to me, Floyd A. O'Neill.
At my age, there are a few things you do really well, but one of them is doddering. You watched it as I came up here. Thank you. You said too much. It is a thing that is common among historians. It is my great honor to introduce my friend Richard White. Richard White burst upon the scene of history the first time he really got an amazing amount of national attention was with his book, The Middle Ground. It won 6 national prizes, including a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Now that's a hell of a way to start, if I may use that phrase. Beyond that, the MacArthur Genius Award. Beyond that, President of the Western History Association. And the Governor's Award for one of his favorite books, for me was remembering a Hanegraan. Well, it has Ireland in it. He became the president of the Organization of American Historians as well. He has won prizes as far away as Paris in France. He has won the Kahn Award, the Mellon Foundation Distinguished Achievement Award. He has had a second nomination and a finalist for the Pulitzer with his book Railroaded. It's hard to imagine a historian who has done more to change interpretation than Richard White. I was told to take only 1 minute, but I've never listened too closely to Richard. What the hell? I mean, at my age, you tend to get bullheaded. Of course, I'm so modest. But at any rate, what I want to say is he is now a professor and holder of a chair at Stanford University, and he's one of the most distinguished professors and one of the most distinguished historians of the United States. Join me in welcoming my friend, Richard White.
Floyd's never paid any attention to anything I've said. I'm going to make no pretense of covering the whole spectrum of public history today. That's what the conference is for. And this is going to be a more personal talk than the kind I usually give, because I've been associated with the American West Center in one way or another since I taught at the University of Utah 30 years ago. And in part because much of what I think about public history has been shaped by the work done at the center. When I came to Utah, I considered both Floyd O'Neill and the center old. I'm now 10 years older than Floyd was when I met him, which may be the single most frightening thing I've ever said in my life. Floyd doesn't so much age as erode. He's constantly revealing new facets. I think of him as our equivalent of Bryce Canyon. And I think we should just get it over with and just make him a national monument. When I was at Utah, there were a few other centers devoted to the American West. Since then, they've proliferated. Much of them have much better funding than the American West Center, but very few are as good. And most have wisely chosen to try to expand on what the American West Center does, trying new things rather than imitating it, because it's inimitable. When I came here and first met Floyd, I had only the vaguest idea about public history. It was what people did in museums. It was what was inscribed on historical landmarks. I was then, and in some ways I still am now, a snotty academic historian. I figured that much of what went on in museums and virtually everything on landmarks was celebratory at best and a half-truth at worst. The American West Center quickly taught me that I didn't know anything about public history. It also made me feel a great deal better about my ignorance, because it was not at all clear what public history was, in large part because the American West Center was inventing what it was. I don't know how things are now, but it used to be hard to grasp the rules at the American West Center. I'm currently writing a volume for the Oxford History of the United States, and I recently ran across a quote, perhaps apocryphal. Actually, I now say perhaps apocryphal anytime I give a second-hand quote. This one is attributed to Thomas Edison. A new employee asked Edison about the rules of his lab. Edison replied, "Hell, there are no rules here. We're trying to accomplish something." Floyd had standards, and you better meet them. But the rules were up to you. Watching the work at the center, I eventually figured out that what distinguishes public history from other kinds of history. This took time. It was certainly not a set of rules, nor was it a defined set of practices. It wasn't even a discrete set of topics or a different audience, nor was it the questions per se. Public historians usually pursue questions similar to those of other academic historians. All historians have to meet the same evidentiary standards. There are two key differences between public history and other academic history, and I'll take them one at a time. The first and most important is who gets to ask the first and most basic questions. In public history, it's the public who gets to pose the questions. Much of the history I write as an academic historian stems from either my own curiosity or from consensus among working historians as to what the important questions are, or from a kind of vague sense that I have of what people need to know or at least should know. What the public wants me to write about usually has little to do with it. As my wife would be the first one to tell you, I take an unreasonable pleasure in asking questions my audience would prefer I didn't ask. I blame this on the nuns. I went to a Catholic school for my education, and I learned the sign of a good question was that when the nuns told me to shut up, or that this was a mystery, that I was probably on to something. But I digress. The point is that most of the history I write, I formulate the initial questions. But I also write public history, of the kind that the Center has produced for years. Public history arises from the premise that the public determines what it wants and needs to know. The historian still delivers an answer, but it's an answer to the public's questions. The reason the Center did this better than any other place I know was largely because of Floyd O'Neill and the legacy he created that passed on through Richard Hart, Dan McCool, Greg Smoke, and many others. Floyd taught high school before he got his PhD. Floyd knew Indian country, and Floyd knew Mormon country. He knew the rural West, and he knew the urban West. He could get money from the Ford Foundation even when he couldn't get it from his own university's administration. He thought the advancement of knowledge meant putting books in grammar schools and high schools, as well as in university libraries. He thought that because Indians had grammar schools and high schools, the university should serve these schools as much as any other schools. Floyd thought that the purpose of the Center was not to make the university a more comfortable place for academics, but to put academics to work so that the West was a better place, better educated, more tolerant, and more just. And he thought that the people living in the West were the best guide to what they needed to know in order to do this. The Center has done considerable work beyond its work with tribes, but the work with the tribes has been at the heart of much of what the Center has done. Much of my own thinking about public history springs from that work with Indian tribes. It's what I'll concentrate on today. In the simplest version of working with the tribes decide what it needs to know, and the historian produces it. But as anyone who's ever done this work knows, this is the most anodyne version of the process. The tribes need historians because so much of the rights of Indian peoples under the law springs from treaties. And those treaties are embedded in quite particular paths. The legal standard is that treaties need to be interpreted according to how Indians understood them at the time that they were negotiated. This means that treaty cases are inevitably historical. At issue in a treaty case are both facts and context. But the original question, at least in my experience, that leads to the facts and context comes from within the tribe itself. Tribal members know the treaties in often impressive detail. There is a collective memory of unkept promises, disputed clauses, and unpaid funds. There is often a detailed or scattered and partial knowledge of otherwise forgotten events. And there is also a vernacular intellectual tradition in which tribal members have, to the best of their abilities, combed the archives for information and for evidence. Dealing with the tribes is not only to deal with quite knowledgeable consumers of historical knowledge, but also with impressive vernacular historians. So why do the tribes need public history? Why can't they just testify about the treaties? In part, it's a question of credentials before the court. But that is not the only reason. Public historians are critical even when the consumers have a deep knowledge of their own past. Public historians provide context. Public historians share the training of other academic historians. They have the ability to contextualize, to give meaning and potency to what might seem meaningless, trivial, or peripheral events. They can also keep things in perspective. They know when a mountain is a mountain and when a molehill is just a molehill. Public historians, particularly those who do this work a great deal, again, Richard Hart and Greg Smoker too, bring to this work a knowledge of the archives that is absolutely essential. This is the kind of history where the devil is in the details. It demands the ability to trace documents, see connections, and to look beyond the immediate sources. In a world that gets more and more reduced to the internet, it is more and more important to master the archives. It is essential to know the gaps in collections and how they might be filled. I'm a professional historian, and the mastery of the archives is a skill that I admire more and more as I age. I admire it perhaps because it is something that only comes with experience. And I'm reaching an age where experience is about the only strong suit I can any longer muster. Many of the very best archival historians tend to be public historians, who need, because of the nature of their work, to be attuned to details, quite specific details. And this leads to the second distinctive thing about public history. Academic historians work in the archives and know the archives. These are not places, however, easily navigated by the public. And academic historians, by and large, do not see creating wider access to the archives as part of their calling. Public historians do. They make access to the archives and sources easier by creating new archives through their own research. The cumulative work of public historians in treaty case after treaty case, tribal history after tribal history, water rights investigation after water rights investigation, as well as the work of historical societies and museums, can, as the center has done, create a formidable database, new archives, that can be deposited with tribes and other communities and reused in other cases and for other purposes and recycled virtually endlessly. The American West Center has helped create archives at many of the pueblos, at Hoopa, Lummi, the Nevada Intertribal Council. Actually, looking at this, I have such a long list, I'm not going to read it all, that it will go all the way through. This democratization of the archives is an important thing. This is a work that has, until recently, largely taken place on paper. But it is a place which is now taking place digitally. This is both a huge advantage and a significant challenge, as I'm sure is going to be talked about in the next couple of days. As part of the work that I'm doing with the Grand Traverse Ottawas of Michigan, Russ Overton, a public historian, and I had to create a GIS database, which I would show you, except it's tribal property and the case hasn't been heard, so of course I cannot actually show you that, which shows every piece of land on the old reservation, how it was allotted, sold, or otherwise alienated. We compiled the database and made it digital with the help of Eric Steiner, a geographer, at the Spatial History Lab at Stanford. And that's a lab whose inspiration came, in part, from the American West Center. We established the database and the digital maps in order to pursue claims cases, because in court, you need to specify what was stolen, when it was stolen, and who stole it. Generic accusations don't fly. And when the tribal council saw it, they immediately saw its possibilities, but that's not what entranced them. For them, the database was genealogical. They could locate relatives, place them on the land, connect them with other relatives, and put together a family as well as a tribal past. This had not been our intent, but then in public history, we were not really in charge. This is only a minor example of how public history keeps historians grounded in a set of concerns rooted in genealogy, community, local history, and lived identity, that while they may go in and out of fashion in the academy, force us to deal with questions whose consequences are immediate, practical, and tangible for those actually using the history. This immediacy occurs on a variety of scales, not just the familial and personal. I've done a lot of historical writing, and I've accustomed myself to recognizing that whatever influence my academic writing has, it will take years to be realized. But public history, particularly histories that influence courts or public agencies, can have nearly immediate influence, or they can have immediate influence once the rather lengthy passage through the courts is over. Things change. Indian plaintiffs get access to resources and funds. The funds produce housing, scholarships, land acquisitions, and more. This is true well beyond treaty cases. Public historians can influence public policy with an immediacy and a directness that does not usually come with most historical writing. As the late sainted and always contentious Hal Rothman knew, reports on the origins, implementation, and context of the creation and operation of a national park, a national monument, or a wilderness area work themselves out in the here and now. In focusing on the products and results of the center's work, it's easy to miss the process itself and the results that spring from that process. It is impossible to do public history without confronting either directly or indirectly the messiness of constructing a history. Public history, in my experience, is necessarily collaborative, which means that historians have to work outside the guild. When doing a public history for a tribe, a community, or a public agency, an historian has to work with people who are not historians. They are community members, lawyers, administrators, and students. These people often possess a great deal of knowledge about the past. But knowledge about the past is not the equivalent of academic history. Academic history is a very particular way of studying that common past. It is a very powerful way, and it comes from disciplinary training. Academic history is what my colleague at Stanford, Sam Weinberg, has called an unnatural act. Interest in the past is natural. We all recall and narrate the past, and listen and contest as others give accounts of the past. This happens every day. What academic history does is to force stories about the past and the evidence that they use to submit to interrogation. Interrogation under quite particular disciplinary standards of evidence. This is not what people normally do when they tell stories about the past. It is unnatural. In public history, the conflict is sometimes between disciplinary standards and sometimes between academic and a more popular history. Lawyers, for example, have disciplinary standards that they use to evaluate the past. They judge historical evidence by legal rules of evidence, which determines admissibility in court. These rules are arcane, arbitrary, and to a historian, slightly cracked. But they are designed to create clarity. They yield answers to questions of what counts as evidence in a given case that are different from the standards historians apply. This causes, as anybody who's done this work knows, considerable tension between historians and lawyers. There is a second set of tensions, however, that arises from working in the public sphere. And in this, historians stand apart from both lawyers and the public that commissions a history. Lawyers are like historians in bringing disciplinary standards to bear. But they're unlike historians, and like tribal members, community members, in treating the past instrumentally. Lawyers and the public want a useful past, one that will allow them to achieve a desired end in the present. Public historians, if they're doing their job, want to create histories that do work in the world, but they have to strain against a narrow instrumentality. In part, we do this for our own instrumental reasons. It is our job to bring bad news on the grounds that lawyers, tribes, and other clients cannot protect themselves from what they do not know. But in part, we are the bearers of bad news for disciplinary reasons. These disciplinary reasons are often a subject of considerable confusion, embodied in the old debate about objectivity that was the theme of Peter Novick's That Noble Dream, the objectivity question in the American historical profession, which most American historians have to read in graduate school. But as Thomas Haskell has written in an article not nearly so widely read, objectivity has gotten confused with neutrality. No historian, no human being is neutral. We cannot pretend that we don't care about many of the things that happen in the world, or have happened in the world. Historians have disciplinary rules precisely because none of us are neutral. It is the rules that produce the quality that we call objectivity. The best way to enforce the rules is to operate as a community that produces knowledge. Truth, as American pragmatists recognized long ago, is collaborative and social. It is a result not so much of individuals, but of communities of knowledge. Historians have to function as a community because singly, none of us can be trusted. When I write a public history, I am not neutral, but I am objective in the sense of following the disciplinary rules. I am not neutral because I sympathize with the tribes, the environmental groups, and the public agencies that I work with. If I did not sympathize with them, I would not work for them. But this does not mean that I tell them what they want to hear. My first goal is to meet the standards of my guild and profession. I know that whatever I write will be read by other historians as good as I am. And if they can show that I violated accepted standards, I am dead in the water. In 1994, I was an expert witness in a shellfish case in Western Washington. Years before that, in the late 1960s, I had been active in Indian fishing rights demonstrations at Frank's Landing on the Nisqually River in Washington. I was then 21, a senior in college from which I was frequently absent. And it was the first time that I had lived with and known more than individual Indians. The Nisqually did more good for me than I ever did for them, except I provided them with immense amounts of unintended amusement. In many ways, the experience made me an historian. 25 years later, I testified for the Nisqually and other Puget Sound tribes. During the deposition, when the state of Washington began to lay the basis for impeaching my credentials, they did two things. They did what I would have done if I was in their place. First, they attacked my master's thesis, which I, for good reason, never published. Particularly the sections I wrote in high dudgeon, and which my advisor suggested I should take out. I should have listened to my advisor. I did not take them out. And now I had to disavow them in a deposition before the Attorney General's office of the state of Washington. I had written the treaties were a sham, dictated documents, which was precisely what the state was contending in 1994, hoping to strip the treaties of legal force. I was, I said, then learning to be a historian in graduate school. I was not yet one when I wrote that thesis. And I had not only not published the thesis, but I had consistently written the opposite for 25 years. Their second line of attack went to my involvement at Frank's Landing, arguing that I was an advocate rather than a dispassionate expert. Here I did not disavow anything. My answer went to the distinction between neutrality and objectivity that I have just outlined. I sympathized with the Nisqually and the other tribes. And the tribe got to ask the basic questions that they wanted me to answer, but they were not hiring me to produce the answer that they wanted. My answer in the deposition was that my task was to deliver the news, good or bad. And to check on my behavior is that I, as a professional historian, would have my work examined and, if necessary, refuted by as other historians as good as I am. Lawyers are hired to win a case and provide only the evidence that helps them win the case. Historians doing public history seek to produce a history that can stand up to the criticisms of other historians. A key disciplinary rule is that we cannot deliberately leave out anything which, if included, would falsify or change our argument. The easiest way to discredit any academic history is to cite some piece of evidence that, when inserted, changes the meaning of the story. And this was what I told the opposing counsel. I might sympathize with the tribes, but my job was, as Bernard Bailyn has put it, to deliver the news. Whatever I wrote had to stand up to the only other community that could make or break me, other historians. All this is important because there has been a kind of reaction against the public history done by the Center and other public historians. It has occurred largely because this history has proved so helpful for the publics, particularly the tribes, that have requested it. The criticism is a kind of backhanded compliment. Until recently, the tribes have usually won in court. And there's been a complaint that they do so because they hire historians whose sympathies are with the tribes. These hired guns are better than the state's hired guns and deliver the histories that the tribes need. The charge, sometimes explicit, sometimes implicit, is that these historians bend the histories to benefit their clients. This is a critique that, in my experience, is a combination of sour grapes and willful ignorance about how fraught public history can be. Indian tribes and other communities are hardly homogeneous, and they do not grant the academic historian the right to deliver verdicts on their past, no matter how useful those verdicts might be in court. They are not always, or in fact usually, grateful. I expect to be resented both by the officials of the states that the tribes sue and by the tribes, and I'm rarely disappointed. I expect to have my motives questioned and my conclusions challenged. I never take a job with the tribes without thinking of the advice about working with them that Floyd O'Neill gave me years ago, and which he has most likely forgotten. Just remember, he told me, this will probably not end well. When tribal councils turn over, the first move is often to fire the lawyers and the experts. The long and tangled story of the Center's relation with the Zunis is a history in itself. This challenging of what historians do and this questioning of our motives forces us to defend not only what we do, but why we do it. And this is a good thing. There's a kind of casual cynicism in much of the American public, and among many of my own students, that the world is simply a collection of opinions. You have your opinion, I have mine, and who is to say who is correct? Public historians in this sense are in the front lines of arguing that some things are far more likely to be true than other things, and that getting this right matters. A public history is written to give information and interpretation that a public has requested, and it often will form the basis of a decision designed to shape the way part of the world operates. It should not be written simply to please the public. That public history is collaborative is a critical element of the enterprise. The American West Center is precisely that, a center. It brings together professional historians, scholars in other disciplines, graduate students, and undergraduates. It works with the community members, lawyers, and government officials. The collaborative aspect makes the center a terrific teaching tool. The best teaching I ever saw at Utah was at the center. And the best teaching I have ever done was part of the Spatial History Project at Stanford, which, like the center, was collaborative in doing its scholarship. And this collaborative aspect has also shaped other centers that have been inspired by the American West Center. Today, there are a plethora of American West Centers, virtually all of them doing public history. There's a Center for the American West at the University of Colorado, run by Patty Limerick. It has long been concerned with federal governance in the West, but over the last few years has focused more and more heavily on land, water, and energy use, interjecting itself into public conversations and disputes over water, mining, and recently, fracking. This is probably the only topic that can make working with the tribes seem like a vacation on an Isle of Tranquility. The Bill Lane Center for the American West at Stanford, of which I was a co-founder, was also inspired by the American West Center. I have, as is my wont, moved on, but the center has carved out a niche in public reporting and journalism on the West, on public policy, particularly environmental policy and water, and in working with California and other Western legislatures and officials. The Autry National Center, whose research arm is headed by Steve Aaron and one of whose key figures is Gingy Scharf, focuses on popular history and the cultures of the West. It has done so by starting where the public is, with a West that the public knows and is curious about. Instead of hectoring the public, it contextualizes and explains the West, not only clearly and smartly, but entertainingly. They do this around stuff, an astonishing variety of art and artifacts put together in artful combinations that manage to teach without lecturing. These exhibits do not always give messages to the public, or for that matter, what New York Times reviewers want to hear, but they're engaging and they capture an audience. There are also Western and regional centers at the University of Washington, University of Montana, Utah State, University of Wyoming, University of New Mexico, and far more. Each is a particular niche, but all owes something to the American West Center. The flourishing of public history in the West is not and does not need to be confined to centers or museums or historical societies. John Christensen at UCLA is currently editing Boom, which you haven't seen it, you should take a look at it, which is one of the most interesting, if not the most interesting, publication focusing on the West, in this case only California, but still the West. It combines public journalism, photography, and scholarship to examine issues of public concern. I cite these other examples to underline my major point in this talk. The core of public history lies in who asks the questions, rather than who gives the answer. This definition is somewhat different from the usual definitions of the field, which often settle for a kind of history aimed at the public, as if historians were marksmen and the public were only a target. Such a definition is, I think, insufficient, because a wide variety of history, academic and popular, seeks a public audience. But more than that, such a definition is insufficient because it unintentionally diminishes public history by drawing an artificial line between academic history, which then becomes real history, and public history, which is somehow a watered-down, lesser version of that history. There is no good reason for the demeaning of public history within the academy as a lesser endeavor, something with lower standards, less prestige, and less consequences than other academic history. In terms of methods, rigor, and standards, public history is the same as any other academic history. Public historians are not part of a separate breed. They are trained academic historians, and what they do is a branch of academic history. Many of its practitioners wear two hats. They are respected academic historians who do not abandon their standards or skills when they turn to public history. I do not change my methods or standards when I do public history, and I've been doing it for 40 years. The center has been doing it longer, and it may still be doing it 50 years from now, after I am long gone. Floyd, however, I imagine, will still be here. Thank you.